In 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley stood at the bottom of an excavation trench in southern Iraq, staring at 8 feet of water-laid clay. No pottery, no artefacts, no trace of human presence, just sterile sediment deposited by flooding. Below this layer, the remains of an ancient settlement. Above it, Sumerian civilization continued. Woolley believed he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. The reality proved more complex, but no less significant. Catastrophic floods did sweep Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, and the Sumerians remembered. They wrote accounts preserved in clay tablets for 4,000 years, accounts that described not just the floods themselves, but the warnings that preceded them, the figures who controlled them, and the knowledge that survived them. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Comment where you are right now and what time it is. This investigation spans archaeological trenches and museum vaults, ancient floods and preserved memories. Knowing you're part of this search grounds the inquiry. Your perspective matters. Now let's talk about what Woolley found. The excavation at Ur, one of Mesopotamia's greatest cities, revealed something unexpected. As workers dug through occupation layers filled with pottery shards, building foundations, and everyday objects, they suddenly hit clean clay, 8 feet of it. No artifacts whatsoever. This wasn't fill dirt. It wasn't construction material. The sediment analysis was clear. This was deposited by water. A massive flood had swept through, leaving behind this thick layer of clay before human activity resumed above it. Woolley was convinced this was the flood, the biblical deluge, Noah's catastrophe, the event that supposedly destroyed the world. The newspapers ran with it. Noah's flood found, the headlines proclaimed. But archaeology rarely offers such simple answers. As excavations continued at other Mesopotamian sites, Uruk, Shuruppak, Kish, archaeologists found flood layers at those locations too. But here's the problem. They weren't all from the same time period. The flood layer at Ur dated to around 3800 BC. The one at Shuruppak was from around 2900 BC. Kish had evidence of flooding around 2800 BC. There wasn't one universal flood. There were multiple regional catastrophes separated by centuries. But that doesn't mean the floods weren't real. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was vulnerable to devastating flooding. The rivers could overflow unpredictably. Storm surges from the Persian Gulf could inundate the southern marshlands. When these disasters struck, they could destroy cities, drown populations, and erase generations of accumulated knowledge. And the people remembered. The Sumerian king list, a cuneiform document we'll examine more closely later, divides history into 2 periods, before the flood and after the flood. Then the flood swept over. The text says simply, after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The flood wasn't mythological background noise. It was a historical marker, a civilizational caesura, a moment when everything changed. So the Sumerians wrote about it. Multiple versions of flood accounts survive on clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide. These aren't just literary compositions. They're careful records, copied and recopied across centuries, preserved with the kind of attention you give to something important. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds tablet CBS 1673, the Eridu Genesis, the oldest Sumerian flood account we have. The British Museum has K3375, tablet She of the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing the most detailed flood narrative in ancient literature. Multiple tablets preserve the Atrahasis epic, which frames the flood within a larger story about divine human relationships. These accounts share remarkable consistency. A divine figure warns a chosen survivor. Specific instructions are given. A boat is built to precise specifications. The flood comes with coordinated intensity. The survivor emerges, makes offerings, becomes a guardian of knowledge. But they also share something else. Detailed sequences. Timing is specified. 6 days, 7 days. Multiple divine agents coordinate actions. Water sources are systematically manipulated. The survivor doesn't just escape randomly, he's warned in advance, given technical instructions, and positioned to preserve not just biological life, but cultural knowledge, craftsmen, specialists, the seed of civilization itself. Now, mainstream scholarship interprets these accounts as mythological narratives preserving memory of real disasters. Divine causation was the ancient world's framework for understanding natural catastrophes. The gods made the flood happen because that's how ancient people explained devastating events beyond human control. And that interpretation is almost certainly correct. But some elements are curious enough to warrant closer examination, not because they prove something extraordinary, but because rigorous investigation is intellectually valuable regardless of conclusions. What if, and this is a carefully qualified what if, these accounts preserve more than just memory of disasters? What if the detailed sequences, the specific warnings, the systematic water management by divine figures preserve distorted memory of sophisticated environmental knowledge, encoded in theological language after the technical understanding was lost, or the methods became unavailable? That's the question we're investigating in this script, not as settled fact, not as certain conclusion, but as intellectually honest inquiry into what the tablets actually say and what they might preserve. We'll examine three interpretive frameworks. Framework A. These are mythological accounts serving theological and social functions. This is the mainstream interpretation, supported by overwhelming scholarly consensus and almost certainly correct. Framework B. These accounts encode memory of advanced human knowledge, sophisticated understanding of hydrology, meteorology, water management, attributed to divine sources after technical comprehension was lost. Framework C. These accounts preserve memory of actual environmental manipulation capabilities possessed by the Anunnaki, whether understood as advanced beings, predecessor civilizations, or something else. The evidence strongly favours Framework A, but examining the alternatives forces rigorous analysis of textual patterns, archaeological evidence, and our own interpretive assumptions. The investigation has value even if the hypothesis is weak. So let's begin where the Sumerians began, with the claim that their knowledge came from before the flood, from figures who taught civilization's arts when the world was young. To understand what the tablets say about the floods, we need to know who wrote them and what they claimed about the knowledge they preserved. Before the waters came, the Sumerians didn't claim to invent their civilization. They claimed to inherit it from divine teachers, from antediluvian sages, from a time before catastrophe. This framing appears consistently across Mesopotamian literature. The World Blundell Prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum, presents the Sumerian King List, a chronological record of rulers that divides history into two distinct periods. The first section lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalha ruled in Eridu for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled in Bad Tabira for 43,200 years. The list continues through 8 rulers, totaling 241,200 years of antediluvian kingship. Then comes the pivotal line, then the flood swept over. After this catastrophe, the text states, after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Notice the language. Kingship wasn't invented in Kish, it was lowered from heaven. It descended again. Civilization resumed. Knowledge was restored. This pattern, civilization as recovered rather than originated, appears throughout Mesopotamian thought, but it's most explicit in the Apkallu tradition. The Apkallu were 7 sages who lived before the flood and brought the arts of civilization to humanity. The fullest account comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek around 290 preserving older Mesopotamian traditions. Berossus describes a being named Uanas, who emerged from the Persian Gulf, a creature with the body of a fish and the head of a man. Uanas taught the people writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, legal codes, and city planning. During the day he instructed. At night he returned to the sea. Other Apkallu followed, each bringing additional knowledge. Now, later Neo-Assyrian texts, over 1,000 years after the Sumerian period, still invoke the Apkallu as guardians of sacred knowledge. Temple rituals include figurines of these sages buried in foundation deposits, protecting buildings with the wisdom they brought. The tradition was persistent. Civilization didn't originate with us. It was taught by beings who came before. How should we interpret this? Framework A, the mainstream view, understands this as mythological legitimation. Ancient societies often framed their institutions as divinely ordained to give them authority. The Apkallu are literary devices, theological explanations for the origin of culture. They didn't exist historically. They represent the ancient Near Eastern way of explaining why humans have knowledge. This interpretation is strong. It fits standard patterns of ancient myth-making and requires no extraordinary assumptions. But there's an interesting archaeological context worth noting. Before the Sumerians emerged as a distinct culture around 3500 BC, the Ubaid culture occupied southern Mesopotamia from roughly 5000 to 4000 BCE. The Ubaid period shows sophisticated development, planned towns, irrigation networks, long-distance trade, painted pottery, temple architecture. The Ubaid people weren't primitive. They understood water management, agriculture, craft specialization, and social organization. When catastrophic floods disrupted Mesopotamian civilization around 2900 BCE, they would have destroyed cities and killed populations, but some knowledge could have survived, passed down by survivors. This leads to Framework B. What if knowledge from the Apkallu represents cultural memory of predecessor sophistication? Not divine beings, but actual skilled humans whose knowledge survived catastrophe and was later attributed to mythological sages when direct memory faded. This doesn't require gods or aliens, just normal processes of cultural memory and mythologization. The Ubaid were advanced relative to earlier cultures. Floods disrupted civilization. Some knowledge survived. Later generations attributed that preserved knowledge to pre-flood sages. Framework C takes it literally. The Apkallu were actual advanced beings, extraterrestrial visitors, survivors of a predecessor civilization, or some other non-human intelligence who taught primitive humans and whose memory was preserved in mythological form. This interpretation requires extraordinary assumptions, advanced beings for which we have no physical evidence, capabilities beyond known biology, and explanations for why they would teach humans, but leave no archaeological trace beyond mythology. The evidence doesn't support Framework C strongly. It requires too many leaps, too many missing pieces. But here's what's worth noting, regardless of framework. The Sumerians framed their civilization as preserved, not invented. Whether that preservation was of divine teachings, Ubaid knowledge, or their own cultural achievements reinterpreted through myth, the self-perception was consistent. We are guardians of knowledge from before. We survived catastrophe. We remember. This matters because when we examine the flood accounts themselves, we find the same theme. Specific individuals warned in advance, given instructions, positioned to preserve knowledge, and granted special status after emergence. The survivor isn't random. The survivor is chosen specifically because they can preserve what matters. So who were these survivors? And what exactly did the accounts say they preserved? Let's examine the oldest version we have, the Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 1673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra's warning. The tablet is fragmentary. Time and damage have erased portions of the text. But what survives is significant. CBS 1673 preserves the Eridu Genesis, the oldest Sumerian flood account, copied in the 17th century BC from earlier traditions now lost. The text describes creation, the establishment of cities, and then catastrophe. The gods decree a flood. The decision is made to destroy humanity. But Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water and magic, opposes the plan. Here's where it gets interesting. Enki doesn't openly defy the other gods. He can't directly warn the flood hero, Ziusudra, because that would violate the divine decree. So he uses a clever workaround. Enki approaches the wall of Ziusudra's house and speaks to it. Wall, pay attention. The text has Enki delivering instructions to the wall itself, knowing Ziusudra is inside listening. Ziusudra, standing at its side, heard. The warning is indirect, but effective. Enki tells the wall to instruct Ziusudra, destroy your house, build a boat. Abandon possessions, save life. Bring into the boat the seed of all living things. Why this indirect method? Because Enki is subverting the will of the other gods, particularly Enlil, who decreed the flood. If Enki warned Ziusudra directly, he'd be openly rebelling. The wall speaking allows him to technically comply with the prohibition while ensuring the knowledge gets through. This is knowledge transmission despite prohibition. Someone with information about coming catastrophe finds a way to pass warning to someone who can act on it. Ziusudra is described in the text as pious and God-fearing. He's characterized by attentiveness to divine will, obedience, and presumably competence, qualities that make him suitable for the preservation role. The flood comes. The text describes it. All the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood swept over the cult centres. Notice the phrasing, windstorms attacking as one. This isn't described as random natural disaster, but as coordinated action. Whether this is poetic language or something else depends on your interpretive framework. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. Specific timing, consistently mentioned across versions. When the waters recede, Ziusudra emerges. He opens the window of his boat, and sunlight streams in. He prostrates himself before the sun god An and makes sacrifice. The gods smell the offering and gather around. Ziusudra is granted divine favour. More than that, he's granted immortality. Life like a god they give him, breath eternal like a god they bring down for him. Ziusudra is then taken to Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, and settled there to live forever. So the survivor doesn't just escape death. He's elevated to special status, removed from normal human existence, positioned in a sacred location, and made guardian of what was preserved. Let's compare this warning system to other flood traditions. In the biblical account, God speaks directly to Noah, I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth. Make yourself an ark. No intermediary, no wall speaking, just direct divine communication. In Greek tradition, Zeus decides to flood the earth. Prometheus, the god who gave humans fire and knowledge, warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest and survives. The pattern across traditions, a knowledge holding divine figure ensures survival information reaches someone capable of acting on it. The flood isn't random disaster that happens to spare a lucky few. It's preceded by warning, instruction, preparation. Why? Framework A says this is narrative structure. Myths need heroes, and heroes need divine favour to justify their survival. The warning system explains why the protagonist lived when everyone else died. He was specially chosen and divinely guided. This is solid literary analysis. Ancient epics regularly feature divine intervention in human affairs. The warning system serves theological and narrative functions. But Framework B asks, could this preserve memory of actual warning systems? Throughout history, when those with knowledge of coming disasters, whether floods, famines, volcanic eruptions, have tried to warn others, the warnings often come indirectly, maybe through intermediaries. maybe against official policy, maybe despite prohibitions from authorities who don't want to cause panic. If catastrophic flooding was preceded by weather changes, water level fluctuations, or other observable indicators, and if some skilled observers understood these signs, they might have warned specific individuals to prepare, preserve supplies, and protect knowledge. After catastrophe, survivors might remember, someone warned us. Someone who understood the waters told us to prepare. That knowledge saved us. Framework B doesn't require gods, just knowledge, warning, and attribution to divine sources when later generations no longer understood the original technical basis. Framework C takes it literally. Enki was an actual Anunnaki, being with knowledge of coming deliberate flood, who subverted the plan by warning a human capable of preserving civilization. The evidence doesn't strongly support Framework C. It requires assuming the gods were real advanced beings, which needs extraordinary evidence we don't have. But regardless of framework, the pattern is clear. Knowledge holder transmits survival information. Recipient preserves seed of mankind. Survivor becomes guardian. The eridogenesis is fragmentary. For more detailed sequences, we need the most famous version of the Mesopotamian flood, Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim's account, the flood in detail. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. Tablet C, housed in the British Museum as K3375, contains the flood account told by Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh. The context is important. Gilgamesh, legendary king of Uruk, is searching for immortality. He travels to find Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life. When Gilgamesh asks how Utnapishtim achieved this, the old man tells his story. I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a hidden matter. I will tell you a secret of the gods. The city is Shuruppak on the Euphrates. The gods meet in council and decree that humanity will be destroyed by flood. But Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, opposes this plan. Like in the eridogenesis, Ea cannot directly warn Utnapishtim without violating the divine decree. So he speaks to the wall of Utnapishtim's reed house. Wall, listen to me. Reed house, understand my words. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, and save life. Utnapishtim, standing on the other side, hears everything. But the Gilgamesh version includes far more detail than earlier accounts. E gives precise specifications. Make the boat equal in its dimensions. Let its width match its length. Cover it with a roof like the Apsu. The boat is to be a cube, 120 cubits in length, width and height, roughly 180 feet per side. 7 decks, 9 compartments per deck, waterproofed with bitumen inside and out. These are specific technical instructions. Whether they're realistic boat building guidance or symbolic numbers depends on your interpretation. A cube wouldn't be ideal for seafaring, but if you're surviving a flood where there's nowhere to sail anyway, it might function as a stable floating container. Utnapishtim follows the instructions. He gathers materials, constructs the boat, and begins loading. And here's a critical detail. All the living beings that I loaded on it, this includes his family, his relatives, the craftsmen who helped build the boat, beasts of the field, wild creatures of the field. Notice craftsmen specifically mentioned, not just biological life, but knowledge bearers, the specialists who understood construction, metallurgy, toolmaking, agriculture. They're explicitly preserved. This emphasis on preserving knowledge alongside life appears across versions and seems deliberate. Then the flood begins. The description is vivid, dramatic, and detailed. Let me read the sequence. From the horizon came a black cloud. Adad the storm god thundered within it. Shalat and Hanish, the divine heralds, went before. Nergal, god of the underworld, pulled out the mooring poles. Ninurta, god of war, made the dikes overflow. Stop there. Multiple divine agents, each performing specific functions. Adad thundering, heralds proceeding, Nergal removing restraints, bowls that held water back, Ninurta breaching dikes. This reads less like natural disaster description and more like coordinated operation, whether that's poetic language depicting organised divine action, encoded memory of actual water management infrastructure being systematically breached, or something else depends on framework. Framework A. This is epic poetry. The pantheon acts together dramatically to show divine power and coordination. It's mythological narrative, not technical documentation. Framework B. Could this preserve memory of actual hydraulic infrastructure failure? Mooring poles, dikes, overflow systems, these are real elements of Mesopotamian water management. If flooding resulted from infrastructure breaching, survivors might remember it as coordinated destruction. Framework C. Multiple Anunnaki agents acting in specific sequence to cause deliberate flood. The text continues. The tempest, the flood, the storm overwhelmed the land. For 6 days and 6 nights the wind blew. The deluge and storm devastated the land. 6 days precise timing again. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest, the flood, the storm ceased. The sea grew calm. The deluge was stilled. Utnapishtim opens a window. Sunlight enters. He looks out at the devastation. I looked at the weather. Stillness had set in. All of humanity had returned to clay. The landscape was flat as a rooftop. The boat has grounded on Mount Nisir in the mountains of Kurdistan. Now comes another systematic procedure, the bird release test. I sent forth a dove and let it go. The dove went and searched, but no landing place appeared, so it returned to me. I sent forth a swallow and let it go. The swallow went and searched, but no landing place appeared, so it returned to me. I sent forth a raven and let it go. The raven went and saw that the waters had receded. It ate, it flew around, it cawed, and it did not return to me. This is methodical verification. Different birds have different behaviours. The raven doesn't return, indicating suitable habitat is available. The testing process shows systematic assessment, not random hope. Utnapishtim releases all the animals and makes offerings to the gods on the mountain peak. I scattered incense on the peak of the mountain. I set up 7 and 7 ritual vessels. Into the bottom of them I poured reeds, cedar, and myrtle. The gods smell the offering and gather like flies over the sacrifice, but there's immediate divine conflict. Enlil arrives and is furious. Who has survived the destruction? No man was to live through the annihilation. Ea defends his action. How could you bring about a flood without my counsel? You should have had the lion bring slaughter, or the wolf. You should have had famine attack, or plague. I did not reveal the secret of the gods. I let Atrahasis see a dream, and thus he learnt the secret of the gods. This is fascinating. He essentially argues, if you wanted to reduce human population, there were targeted methods, predators, famine, disease. Why total destruction? And he defends his subversion, technical compliance glitch, while achieving his goal, revival of humanity's seed. Enlil, convinced by Ea's argument, grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. Formerly, Utnapishtim was a human being. Now Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like us gods. Utnapishtim shall reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. So the survivor is elevated, granted eternal life, and placed at a strategic location, the mouth of the rivers, where rivers meet the sea, where fresh water and salt water converge, where water management would be critical, where knowledge of hydraulics would be essential. Utnapishtim becomes a guardian stationed at a hydrologically significant location, preserving knowledge for any future seeker wise enough to find him, like Gilgamesh. Now let's be clear about genre. The Epic of Gilgamesh is magnificent literature, dramatic, emotionally powerful, theologically sophisticated. Reading it as technical documentation of environmental manipulation requires ignoring its primary function as epic poetry. Framework A is almost certainly correct. This is mythological narrative, not engineering manual. But even within that framework, certain elements are worth noting. The coordination, the emphasis on preserving craftsmen, the systematic testing procedures, the survivor's placement at a hydraulically significant location. These don't prove alternative interpretation, but they're curious enough to examine. 2 flood accounts analysed. Eridu Genesis and Gilgamesh. Both show knowledge holders warning survivors, coordinated action causing flood, preservation of life and knowledge, and elevated status for survivor. A third version, the Atrahasis epic, provides different context, why the flood was decreed in the first place. The Atrahasis question, why destroy what you created? The Atrahasis epic, preserved on Old Babylonian tablets around 1635 BCE, frames the flood within a larger theological narrative about divine-human relationships. And it asks an uncomfortable question. If the gods created humans for specific purposes, why destroy them? The epic begins not with humanity, but with divine labour problems. When the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads, the Igigi, lesser gods, are forced to maintain irrigation canals, dig waterways, and perform the backbreaking labour necessary to sustain civilization. They work for 40 years, but eventually rebel. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard. The misery too much. The Igigi march on Enlil's temple, surround it, and refuse to continue working. This creates a crisis. Without divine labour, the irrigation systems fail. Without irrigation, agriculture collapses. Civilization cannot function. Enki proposes a solution. Let the birth goddess create mankind. Let humans bear the load of the gods. The goddess Nintu, also called Mummy or Belet Ili, creates humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god named Wei Ilu. The divine blood transfers intelligence and life force into humanity. The plan works. Humans multiply, perform the labour, maintain the canals, make offerings. Civilization functions smoothly for a while. Then humans become too successful. They multiply excessively. Their numbers grow beyond what the gods anticipated. Enlil begins complaining, the noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar I am deprived of sleep. Now this noise is often interpreted metaphorically, not literal sound, but human activity, presence, perhaps hubris or overreach. The text isn't entirely clear, but Enlil decides humans must be reduced. He sends plague. Humanity suffers, but Enki teaches humans how to make offerings to Namtar, the plague god, and the disease subsides. Enlil sends drought. Enki instructs humans to appeal to the storm god, and rain returns. Enlil sends famine. Again, Enki provides countermeasures. Each time, Enlil attempts population control. Each time, Enki subverts it. Finally, Enlil decrees the ultimate solution, the flood. I will destroy the human race. Let the flood sweep over. This time, Enlil makes the other gods swear an oath not to warn humanity. But Ea finds his workaround. He speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house. The name Atrahasis means exceedingly wise, appropriate for the one chosen to preserve knowledge. E's instructions parallel other versions. Build a boat, cover it with a roof, bring in seed of all living things. The flood comes and nearly annihilates humanity. But here's what happens after the flood that's particularly revealing. The gods realise they made a mistake. Without humans, no one makes offerings. No one maintains temples. No one performs the labour the gods created humans to do. The gods gather, hungry and powerless. The gods were cowering like dogs, crouching by the outer wall. When Utnapishtim, called Atrahasis in this version, makes his sacrifice, the gods gather like flies around the offering, desperate for sustenance. Enlil arrives furious that someone survived, but eventually the gods reach a compromise. Nintu proposes population control measures that won't require total destruction. Some women will be barren, demons will snatch infants, priestesses will be celibate, population will be managed, not eliminated. But there's another element implied, knowledge management. After the flood, humans no longer have the same direct relationship with the divine. Knowledge isn't openly shared. Direct divine teaching, like Enki instructing Atrahasis, becomes rare. An intermediary priest class emerges, controlling access to sacred knowledge. The flood isn't just biological reset, its restructuring of the divine-human relationship, including how knowledge is transmitted. Now, why would gods create humans, then try to destroy them, then compromise on controlled population? Framework A. This is theological allegory explaining several things. Human mortality, why we die despite having divine spark. Social hierarchy, why heists control sacred knowledge. Population limits, why infertility, infant mortality, celibate priestesses exist. Divine justice, gods are powerful but not uniformly malevolent. As mythology, it functions brilliantly. It addresses real human concerns, suffering, death, inequality, within a theological framework. Framework B asks, could this encode historical memory? Real catastrophic flood around 2900 BC disrupts Mesopotamian civilization. After catastrophe, social reorganization occurs. Population is reduced versus fewer than pre-flood. Knowledge becomes centralized. Elite class emerges as literacy gatekeepers. Institutional controls increase temple bureaucracy, royal authority. Direct knowledge transmission replaced by mediated access. The gods' decreased humanity and restructured knowledge access could be mythological encoding of actual post-catastrophe social changes. Framework C. Anunnaki deliberately caused flood for population control. One member subverted plan. Compromise reached, limiting both population and knowledge access. The evidence doesn't strongly support Framework C. It requires assuming gods were real advanced beings, which needs physical evidence we lack. But regardless of framework, the pattern is consistent. Flood isn't random natural disaster, it's deliberate action with specific purpose. Knowledge holder subverts plan. Survivor preserves seed. Post-flood world has different knowledge management. 3 flood accounts examined: Eridugenesis, Gilgamesh, Atrahasis. Time to compare patterns. The pattern across waters. We've examined 3 independent flood accounts from Mesopotamian literature. Now let's identify what's consistent across all versions and what varies. Consistent elements. Divine knowledge holder warns survivor. In every version, Enki Ea opposes the flood and finds a way to warn the chosen survivor despite divine prohibition. Boat specifications given. Each version includes technical details about construction, though specific dimensions vary. Duration specified. 7 days in Eridugenesis and Atrahasis, 6 days in Gilgamesh. Precise timing consistently mentioned. Preservation of seed. Not just biological survival, but cultural preservation, family, craftsmen, knowledge bearers explicitly included. Sacrifice after emergence. The survivor makes offerings, and the gods respond positively. Grant of immortality. The survivor receives eternal life and special status as guardian. Divine conflict revealed. Not all gods agreed to the flood. Enki's subversion is central to every version. Variations across versions. Names: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim Quote, boat shape, cube in Gilgamesh, possibly round in some interpretations of other versions. Settlement location, Dilmun in Eridugenesis, mouth of rivers in Gilgamesh. Narrative emphasis. Eridugenesis is brief and fragmentary, Gilgamesh is literary and dramatic, Atrahasis is sociological and theological. Now we need to address mainstream scholarly interpretation seriously because it's strong and well evidenced. Thorkild Jacobson's analysis of Mesopotamian flood traditions emphasizes their multiple functions: theological, exploring divine justice, mercy and power dynamics within the pantheon; etiological, explaining human mortality, social hierarchies and priestly authority; literary, create powerful narratives that resonate emotionally and culturally. Jacobson notes that divine conflict, Enki versus Ent, represents theological debate about justice. Should humanity be destroyed for noise, sin, or should mercy prevail? The narrative resolves this by having the compassionate deity subvert the harsh deity, ultimately leading to compromise. The survivor stories explain and legitimize priesthood authority They preserve sacred knowledge from before the catastrophe, making them essential intermediaries between divine and human realms. Samuel Noah Kramer's position emphasizes that Sumerians remembered real floods, but mythologized them. The warning and survival narrative is literary device, not historical record. Divine knowledge transmission explains civilization's origin in theological terms acceptable to ancient worldview. Irving Finkel's recent scholarship has analysed boat construction passages in detail, arguing that the texts do preserve real boat-building knowledge. Ancient Mesopotamians understood watercraft construction, but the flood as event remains mythological and theological, not technical documentation of environmental manipulation. These scholarly interpretations are strong because flood myths are universal. Greek, Indian, Chinese, Native American, African cultures all have flood traditions with similar patterns: divine warning, boat survival, new beginning. If all encode environmental manipulation, why such universal pattern? More likely, floods are common traumatic events mythologized across cultures. Divine nature control is universal. Every ancient culture attributed weather, seasons, and natural disasters to divine action. Greek Zeus controls storms. Norse Thor controls thunder. Egyptian Set controls storms. Hindu Indra controls rain. This is standard pre-scientific worldview, not unique to Mesopotamia. Genre is well understood. Epic poetry, theological narrative, and mythological literature are well-documented genres. Reading Gilgamesh as technical manual ignores its literary function and cultural context. No extraordinary assumptions required. Mythological interpretation requires only real floods occurred, cultures remembered them. 3. Theological framework explains natural phenomena, all well evidenced. Framework A, mainstream mythological interpretation, is almost certainly correct. But even accepting that, some elements are curious enough to note. Consistency across independent textual traditions. Eridu Genesis, Gilgamesh, and Atrahasis weren't copied from each other, but from shared older traditions. They agree on key elements while varying in details. Emphasis on knowledge preservation, not just biological survival, but specific inclusion of craftsmen, specialists, seed of mankind, phrasing suggesting cultural continuity. Coordinated divine action, multiple agents performing specific roles, Adad thundering, Nergal removing mooring poles, Ninurta breaching dikes. Whether poetic or encoded, the coordination is emphasized. Survivor becomes knowledge keeper. After flood, survivors are granted immortality, stationed at significant locations, become teachers. The archetype is consistent. Post-flood knowledge management changes. Direct divine-human communication becomes rare, mediated through institutional priesthood. Now let's examine the 3 interpretive frameworks in light of this evidence. Framework A, mainstream mythology. Position flood accounts are mythological narratives serving religious, social, and literary functions. Divine agents are theological entities, not historical beings. Environmental control attributed to gods is standard ancient worldview, not memory of actual capabilities. Evidence supporting real geological floods around 2900 BC equal evident. Universal flood myth pattern across cultures. Divine nature control standard in all ancient religions. Literary genre well understood. Poetry, theology. Scholarly consensus, theologists overwhelmingly support. Occam's razor, simplest explanation, fewest assumptions. Assessment, almost certainly correct. Framework B, encoded environmental knowledge. Position, flood accounts preserve distorted memory of sophisticated human environmental understanding. Divine control is metaphorical description of advanced knowledge after technical comprehension was lost. Precision elements are remnants of actual hydraulic, meteorological knowledge, evidence supporting. Real floods disrupted civilization around 2900 BCE. Ubaid culture 5000–4000 was sophisticated in irrigation, town planning. Archaeological evidence of Bronze Age water management systems. Knowledge lost during catastrophe is historically documented. Post-flood, institutional changes in Mesopotamia, Trolley's authority, temple bureaucracy, Sumerian self-framing as knowledge preservers, not originators. Evidence against. No clear evidence of specific advanced knowledge lost. Ubaid sophistication within normal Bronze Age range, lost technology needed. Texts read more naturally as mythology than encoded technical knowledge. Requires assuming hidden meanings texts don't explicitly support. Assessment. Intriguing speculation with some circumstantial support but lacks direct evidence. Framework C. Actual environmental manipulation, highly speculative. Position. Anunnaki were actual advanced beings Stril, predecessor civilization, or other non-human intelligence with capability to control water's weather at regional scale. Flood was deliberate. Texts preserve memory understood as divine because beyond human comprehension. Evidence supporting. Texts consistently attribute flood control to Anunnaki, but this is theological. Coordinated divine action described, but this is mythological narrative. Warning system implies foreknowledge, but this is literary device. Evidence severely against. No physical. Evidence for advanced beings or technology. No modern analogue for regional climate control, unlike acoustic levitation, where small-scale examples exist. Universal mythological pattern. All cultures have divine flood control. Why is Mesopotamia special? Genre confusion. Religious texts as technical documentation. Occam's razor violation requires multiple extraordinary assumptions. Missing evidence problem should find devices, non-human remains, technical descriptions, artistic representations. Comparative mythology, identical. Patterns in Greek, Norse, Egyptian myths are all encoding manipulation. Assessment, highly speculative with minimal supporting evidence and severe evidentiary gaps. Honest comparative assessment. Framework A has strong evidence across all categories. Framework B is plausible but speculative. Framework C is highly speculative with major evidentiary problems. The mainstream interpretation doesn't absolutely rule out alternatives, but absence of evidence, especially extensive absence where evidence should exist, is meaningful. The question remains technically open for new evidence, but current evidence strongly favours mythological interpretation. The value of this investigation exists independent of proving the hypothesis. Rigorous examination of textual patterns, archaeological evidence, and interpretive frameworks is intellectually valuable even if we conclude the hypothesis is weak. So with that honest assessment established, let's examine one more angle, Mesopotamian concepts of divine environmental control beyond floods. Enki's domain, the Abzu and water systems. Enki, or Ea in Akkadian, is the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, magic and fresh water. His dwelling place is the Abzu, usually translated as the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Understanding the Abzu concept is critical to understanding Mesopotamian theology about water and environmental control. The creation epic Enuma Elish describes the primordial state. When on high heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, nothing but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mummu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. Apsu represents fresh water, Tiamat represents salt water. From their mingling, the younger gods emerge, but the younger gods are noisy and disturbing. Apsu complains to Tiamat, their ways have become grievous to me. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. I shall abolish their ways and disperse them. Tiamat objects, but Apsu is determined. When Ea learns of the plan, he acts first. He casts a spell over Apsu, kills him, and establishes his own dwelling in Apsu's place. Ea now controls the fresh water source. Theologically, this represents wisdom conquering chaos. order being established over primordial forces, divine intelligence organizing the cosmos. But could it also reference something physical the Abzu could represent? Mythological realm, cosmic freshwater ocean, primordial chaos subdued, divine wisdom's domain, physical water systems, Mesopotamia's water table, aquifers, the actual fresh waters, sources critical to civilization. Advanced knowledge, understanding or control of hydrology attributed to Enki/Anunnaki. Enki's cult center was Eridu, the southernmost major Sumerian city, historically located in marshlands due to environmental changes over millennia. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed 18 superimposed temples on the same spot, representing over 2,000 years of continuous religious activity. The main temple was called Abzu, House of the Abzu. Why build the god of fresh water's temple in marshlands? Because that's where fresh water meets the sea, where water management is critical, where understanding hydrology would be essential. The Gudea cylinders, inscribed clay cylinders from around 2100 BC now in the Louvre, describe temple construction integrated with water management infrastructure. Gudea's Ininnu temple for Ningirsu includes irrigation systems, and divine guidance comes from deities connected to Enki's lineage. Sacred and practical water control were combined. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated Mesopotamian irrigation, complex canal networks, levees and reservoirs, water distribution systems, maintenance coordination requiring centralized planning, success of irrigation tech's basis of urban civilization. Failure of irrigation tech's collapse happened repeatedly in Mesopotamian history. Knowledge required for large-scale water management includes surveying, determining elevation, water flow patterns, gradient calculations, engineering, canal capacity, water distribution, construction techniques, seasonal prediction, knowing when floods come, optimal planting times, maintenance, coordination, canal cleaning, levee repair, infrastructure upkeep, social organisation, labour mobilisation, water rights adjudication, conflict resolution. This knowledge was valuable, institutional and carefully preserved. When Enki is described as Lord of the Abzu, when texts say he organises fresh water and establishes its courses, what's being described? Framework A, divine mythology. Enki is theological principle of wisdom and water. Abzu is mythological realm. This explains civilization's dependence on fresh water in theological terms. Framework B. Enki is patron god of irrigation engineers, surveyors, water managers. The Abzu references actual water systems. Knowledge of hydrology is attributed to divine source because temple priesthood controlled this technical knowledge. Framework C. Enki was actual advanced being with sophisticated hydrological knowledge, taught water management, memory preserved in theological form. The evidence doesn't require Framework C. Framework A handles the evidence well as pure theology. Framework B is plausible if you assume technical knowledge got encoded in religious language. But here's the interesting observation. Mesopotamians were demonstrably sophisticated water managers. The archaeological evidence is clear. And they attributed this knowledge to Enki, whose domain is the Abzu, the source of fresh water. Whether that attribution is pure theology, encoded recognition of engineering knowledge, or memory of an advanced teacher depends on your interpretive framework. One more theological element worth examining, the ME concept, which includes some references to natural phenomena. The ME and natural forces. The Sumerian concept of ME is challenging to translate. Usually rendered as divine powers, divine ordinances, or divine offices, the ME represent domains of authority, knowledge, or capability. Over 100 ME are catalogued in Sumerian texts, covering civilization's aspects, kingship, priesthood, music, crafts, war, justice, sexual union, and many others. But some ME relate to natural phenomena, ME of the flood, ME of descent to the underworld and ascent, Emi of fear, Emi of kindling, fire, Emi of quenching fire, Emi of weariness, references to seasonal cycles in Emi contexts. The most famous Emi text is Inanna and Enki, where the goddess Inanna visits Enki in Eridu. Enki, drunk on beer, gives her over 60 Emi. She loads them on the boat of heaven and flees to Uruk. Enki tries to retrieve them, but fails. The Emi are now distributed, no longer centralized in Enki's control. The critical element, Emi, are described as transferable objects. If Emi can be stolen, given, transferred, what does this mean for natural force Emi? What is the Emi of the flood? Framework A, abstract divine authority over flooding. Theological concept, not physical object or knowledge. Framework B, practical knowledge of flood patterns, prediction, survival, or water management. This knowledge was valuable, institutionally controlled by temple priesthood, and conceptualized as divine power. Framework C, if Anunnaki could cause floods, this Emi represents that capability transferable between beings. Consider agricultural calendar knowledge. Mesopotamian texts show sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, planting times, irrigation schedules, flood predictions. This knowledge was valuable and controlled by temple institutions. Could ME of the flood mean knowledge of flood patterns rather than mystical flood causing power? Comparison to other cultures. Egyptian, divine control of Nile flood, but also practical irrigation knowledge. Greek, divine control of seasons / non-ipsephety, but also agricultural knowledge. Pattern, divine authority over natural phenomena plus practical knowledge both. Present. Question, does divinity explain knowledge, or does knowledge get attributed to divinity? In societies where priests control literacy, technical knowledge, and institutional memory, attributing that knowledge to divine sources legitimizes priestly authority and protects valuable information. The Emi concept shows Mesopotamian thinking about divine powers as discrete transferable units. When one unit is Emi of the flood, we can ask, is this pure theological authority? Is this practical knowledge encoded in religious language? Is this memory of actual capability? The evidence doesn't definitively answer, but what's clear, knowledge about floods was valuable, institutionally controlled, and conceptualized in theological frameworks. Now let's examine one final curious element, antediluvian measurements, in the Sumerian king list. The numbers before the flood. Return to the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum. The Sumerian king list records 8 antediluvian kings with extraordinarily long reigns.
Alulima, 1,500 years. Alaujar, 3,500 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. Enmengalana, 1,500 years. Dumazid, 3,500 years. And Sipad Zidana, 1,500 years. Enmendrana, 1,200 years. Baratutufla, 1,200 years. Total, 240,200 years.
Now notice the pattern. These numbers aren't random. They're based on Mesopotamian sexagesimal 60 mathematics, Sar 3600, Nur 600, Sososkar 60. All antediluvian reigns are divisible by 60. Most are divisible by 3600. Examples, 28,800 cos 8 Sars, 43,200 cos 12 Sars. If this were pure mythology or random storytelling, why such precise mathematical structure? Why specific sexagesimal multiples rather than round numbers like 1,000,000 years or countless ages? The precision suggests deliberate calculation or data preservation, not mythological fiction. Compared to biblical antediluvians in Genesis 5, 10 figures before the flood with precise lifespans, Adam 930 years, Seth 912 years, Methuselah 969 years, also precise numbers. Also decrease after flood, pattern shared across traditions, long pre-flood lifespans, shorter post-flood lifespans, possible shared ancient tradition or common mythological motif. Scholarly interpretations of these numbers, symbolic numerology, representing cosmic cycles, sacred mathematics, ritual significance, distorted memory, real rulers' reigns in smaller units days, months, converted to years, or generational markers compressed into individual reigns. Kingless propaganda, extending royal lineage into deep past for political legitimacy. Data format, numbers preserve something in mathematical encoding we don't understand. The sexagesimal system itself is. Noteworthy. Sumerian mathematics based on 60 is still used today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This was sophisticated mathematical tradition with precision in astronomical calculations. Why use this precision for mythological fiction? Why not simpler, vaguer numbers? Another curious detail, post-flood kings' reigns gradually decrease. The first post-flood rulers reign for thousands of years, then hundreds, then eventually historical lifespans 20-40 years. The transition from mythic time to human time is gradual and systematic, not abrupt. This suggests mathematical calculation rather than random storytelling. The question, numbers this precise, suggest intention. Either Sumerians created elaborate mathematical mythology, possible but complex. They preserved data in mathematical format, but what data? Information we don't understand encoded numerically. What could the numbers represent, if not literal years? Genealogical information compressed? Astronomical cycles? Dynastic markers? Sacred numerology? Something else? The precision is undeniable. The meaning is unclear. Framework A, symbolic numerology expressing cosmic order, sacred mathematics, or political legitimization. Ancient Near Eastern pattern doesn't require literal interpretation. Framework B, encoded data, real information in mathematical format we haven't decoded, perhaps compressed chronology, astronomical records, or preserved measurements. Framework C, actual antediluvian chronology in units we don't understand, possibly non-human timescale. Honest assessment, this is one of Mesopotamia's most intriguing puzzles. The precision is striking. The meaning remains unclear. Mainstream interpretation fits ancient Near Eastern patterns and requires no extraordinary assumptions. But the mathematical sophistication is noteworthy even if we conclude it's symbolic rather than literal. We've examined flood accounts, water management theology, ME concepts, and antediluvian measurements. Patterns emerge across multiple independent texts. Now we must confront mainstream scholarly interpretation directly and honestly. The mainstream interpretation, mythology and memory. This chapter is critical. We need to present academic scholarly consensus robustly and fairly because it represents lifetimes of expert analysis and is almost certainly correct. What Assyriologists and textual scholars say on flood accounts, Thorkel Jacobson, Samuel Noah Kramer, Irving Finkel, real floods occurred in Mesopotamia around 2900-2800s. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms this. Multiple floods at different times and locations, around 3800s, Shuruppak around 2900s, Kish around 2800s. These were traumatic collective events. Cities were destroyed, populations were killed, civilization was disrupted, people remembered. The memory was preserved in mythology. This is normal. Cultures mythologize traumatic events. The flood becomes a theological narrative explaining divine justice, human mortality, and civilizational origins. Divine causation is standard ancient worldview. All major events, floods, droughts, eclipses, earthquakes, victories, defeats, were attributed to divine action. This wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. Greeks attributed storms to Zeus and Poseidon. Norse attributed thunder to Thor. Egyptians attributed Nile floods to Hapi. Hindus attributed rain to Indra. Attributing natural phenomena to divine will was how pre-scientific societies understood causation. Warning narratives are literary devices. They explain why some people survived when most died, divine favour, special selection, moral worthiness. The protagonist needs divine guidance to justify their survival and subsequent authority. Survivor as knowledge keeper legitimizes priesthood and royal authority. If survivors preserved sacred knowledge from before catastrophe, their descendants, Reests, inherit that authority. The mythology validates social hierarchy. On divine environmental control, every ancient culture attributed natural phenomena to divine action. This is universal pattern, not unique evidence for Mesopotamia being special. Greek, Zeus controls storms, Poseidon controls seas, Demeter controls harvests. Norse, Thor controls thunder, Freyr controls fertility, Ran controls drowning. Egyptian, Set controls storms, Osiris controls Nile flood, Tefnut controls moisture, Hindu, Indra controls rain, Varuna controls cosmic, waters, Agni controls fire. If we read Mesopotamian flood accounts as encoding environmental manipulation, we'd have to apply same interpretation to all cultures. Are all encoding lost technology? More plausible, natural forces attributed to divine will is universal pre-scientific framework. On Enki/water associations. Enki as patron deity of scribes, craftsmen, wisdom, and fresh water is logical within theological system. Fresh water is life-sustaining resource. Associating it with wisdom god makes theological sense. The Abzu as mythological realm, not technical rever, represents cosmic order, primordial chaos subdued by divine intelligence. This is standard creation mythology motif. Enki myths explain civilization's origin in theological terms. Where did knowledge come from? The gods gave it. Why do we have irrigation? Divine instruction. This is etiological mythology, explaining present reality through divine origins. On ME concept, ME are theological framework for organizing cosmic and social order. They represent authority domains, not technological capabilities. Transferability is literary device showing divine political dynamics. Gods compete, negotiate, redistribute power. This appears in Greek mythology, not spheres of influence, Norse divine conflicts over domain, and many others. Similar concepts across cultures don't require assuming literal divine objects. They're mythological organizing principles. On antediluvian numbers, symbolic numerology is common in ancient world. Sacred numbers expressing cosmic cycles, ritual significance, political legitimacy. King lists serve political function, extending dynastic legitimacy into deep mythological past. If your dynasty connects to antediluvian kings, your rule has cosmic sanction. Sexagesimal precision reflects Mesopotamian mathematical sophistication, not data preservation. They were excellent mathematicians. Using sophisticated numbers in mythology shows cultural values, not encoded technical information. On procedural language in flood accounts, this is narrative storytelling, not technical documentation. Ancient epics regularly include vivid sensory details. Homer's Odyssey describes shipbuilding, navigation, combat in specific detail, not because it's technical manual, but because good storytelling includes concrete details. Specific timing, 6 days, 7 days, is literary structure, not technical specification. 7 is sacred number in Near Eastern tradition. 6 days of creation plus 7th day of rest appears in Genesis. These are meaningful numbers, not precise measurements. Coordinated divine action is mythological narrative showing organized pantheon. Gods working together demonstrates divine power and cosmic order. Bird release testing is folklore element appearing in many flood traditions worldwide. It's good narrative detail, not engineering procedure. Why mainstream view is strongest, evidence fits comfortably, flood myths are universal, doesn't require Mesopotamia to be special. Divine nature control is universal biology. Geological floods are real, provides basis for collective memory. Literary genre well. Understood, poetry, myth, theology, no extraordinary assumptions required. You don't need to assume. Lost technology we have no evidence for. Advanced beings we have no physical trace of. Encoded knowledge requiring interpretive gymnastics. Environmental manipulation capabilities with no. Modern analogue. Simple explanation, real floods plus theological worldview starker flood myths. Occam's razor. Simplest explanation is usually correct. Mythological interpretation requires fewest assumptions. Environmental manipulation hypothesis requires advanced beings / technology, capability to control regional weather, this is 6. Knowledge encoded in mythology requires forcing hidden meanings. Mesopotamia being uniquely special despite universal flood myth. Pattern, scholarly consensus. Assyriologists, archaeologists, textual critics who've spent careers analysing these texts in original languages within full cultural contexts overwhelmingly support mythological interpretation. Alternative interpretations, varietal manipulation, encoded technology, ancient astronauts, are fringe. They're not supported by evidence. They're often proposed by non-specialists who lack linguistic expertise, archaeological training, and cultural context. Samuel Noah Kramer summarized it. Sumerian literature reflects sophisticated religious and philosophical thinking. Flood myths preserve memory of real disasters while serving theological functions. Reading them as technical documentation of environmental manipulation imposes modern technological thinking onto ancient religious texts and fundamentally misunderstands their genre and purpose. Our honest acknowledgement: the mainstream interpretation is almost certainly correct. These are mythological and religious texts serving theological and social functions. The evidence fits this interpretation best. It requires fewest assumptions. It's supported by expert scholarly consensus. Alternative readings, particularly environmental manipulation memory, are speculative exercises in asking what if, not evidence-based conclusions. The hypothesis we've been investigating is weak. The evidence doesn't support it strongly. But worth noting, even within mythological framework, some elements are curious. Consistency of warning system across independent versions, emphasis on knowledge preservation, seed of Cain, mathematical precision in king list, post-flood knowledge management changes. These don't. Prove alternative interpretation. They're not smoking guns. But they're interesting enough to examine even if mainstream reading is correct. The value of this investigation isn't proving environmental manipulation occurred. It's that rigorous examination of textual patterns, archaeological evidence, hydraulic capabilities, knowledge transmission systems, and our own interpretive assumptions has intellectual value independent of conclusions. Asking hard questions about ancient texts, even when answers support mainstream interpretation, strengthens our understanding. So with that honest assessment established that Framework A is strongest, let's examine all three frameworks side by side for completeness and intellectual integrity. 3 ways to read the same clay. We've examined the evidence, we've heard scholarly consensus. Now let's present 3 interpretive frameworks with honest assessment of evidence for each, maintaining intellectual integrity throughout. Framework A, mythology and collective memory. Evidence level, strongest. Position, flood accounts and mythological narratives preserving memory of real disasters. Divine control of water and weather represents standard ancient theological worldview. Anunnaki are gods, theological entities, not historical beings. Environmental manipulation means divine authority in mythology, not actual technological capability. Precision in some details reflects literary sophistication, not technical documentation. Evidence supporting real geological floods around 2900-2800 basiological confirmation. Flood myths universal across cultures, Greek, Chinese, Native American, African, doesn't require Mesopotamia being special. Divine nature, control, universal in ancient world Zeus storms. Thor thunder, Indra rain, standard pattern. Literary genre, well understood poetry, theological narrative, etiological myth. Scholarly consensus rheologists overwhelmingly support this interpretation. Occam's razor simplest explanation, requiring fewest assumptions, fits all evidence comfortably without forcing hidden meanings. Strengths: respects textual genre and cultural context. No missing evidence that needs explaining. No extraordinary assumptions about lost technology or advanced beings. Accounts for universal flood myth pattern across unconnected cultures. Supported by lifetimes of expert linguistic and archaeological scholarship. Weaknesses: some curious precision elements but counter-argument. Literary sophistication explains this. Doesn't engage speculative alternatives but counter-argument. Alternatives lack evidence. Assessment: almost certainly correct. This is the scholarly consensus for good reasons. The evidence strongly supports mythological interpretation. Framework B, encoded environmental knowledge. Evidence level, moderate speculation. Position: flood accounts preserve distorted memory of sophisticated human environmental understanding. Anunnaki represent advanced humans, possibly Ubaid predecessors or earlier sophisticated cultures. Divine control is metaphorical description of advanced knowledge after technical understanding was lost over millennia. Precision elements are remnants of actual hydraulic and meteorological knowledge. Post-flood knowledge centralization reflects historical pattern after catastrophic disruption. Evidence supporting real floods disrupted civilization around 2900 BC logical confirmation. Ubaid culture 5000-4000 showed sophistication, planned towns, irrigation networks, craft specialization. Archaeological evidence of Bronze Age water management systems Manaus. Livy's reservoir. Knowledge lost during catastrophe documented historically Libya of Alexandria. Roman engineering knowledge in medieval Europe. Post-flood institutional changes in Mesopotamia. Rise of centralized kingship, temple bureaucracy, priest class as literacy gatekeepers, Sumerian self-framing as knowledge preservers, not originators Kali tradition, king list structure. Some technical details in text structure, water management terminology show practical knowledge. Evidence against. No clear evidence of what specific advanced knowledge was. Lost. Ubaid sophistication was within normal Bronze Age range, lost technology requiring explanation. Texts read more naturally as mythology than encoded technical knowledge. Requires assuming hidden meanings texts don't explicitly support. Might have been was, speculation. Without direct confirmation. Strengths. Doesn't require supernatural beings or impossible technology. Explains attribution to divine sources as cultural memory of advanced predecessors. Plausible that sophisticated knowledge could be lost/distorted over millennia. Accounts for some precision in technical details management, building specifications. Knowledge centralization in priest class after catastrophe is historically common pattern. Weaknesses. Lacks direct textual or archaeological evidence of encoded technical knowledge. Requires interpretive gymnastics, reading between lines rather than plain meaning. Ubaid sophistication doesn't require lost advanced knowledge explanation. Flood accounts read primarily as theological/literary works, not technical manuals. Universal flood myth pattern, not unique to Mesopotamia, weakens encoded knowledge. Hypothesis. Assessment. Intriguing speculation with some circumstantial support, but lacking direct evidence. Plausible as intellectual exercise, but unproven. Framework B. Could be partially true, real floods plus knowledge loss plus mythologization, without requiring environmental manipulation hypothesis. Framework C. Actual environmental manipulation. Evidence level, highly speculative. Position. Anunnaki were actual advanced beings, extraterrestrial visitors, survivors of predecessor civilization, or other non-human intelligence. They possessed capability to control water and weather at regional scale. Flood was deliberate action atrahasis, population control. Enki's subversion by warning survivors represents internal conflict among advanced beings. knowledge restrictions after flood prevented humans from regaining dangerous capabilities. Texts preserve memory of actual events, understood as divine because beyond human comprehension at the time, evidence claimed. Texts consistently attribute flood control to Anunnaki, but this is theological rule. Coordinated divine action described with multiple agents performing specific roles, but this is mythological narrative structure. Warning system implies foreknowledge of. Deliberate event, but this is literary device explaining survival. Post-flood changes in human-divine relationship, but explained by theology and social evolution. Mathematical precision in king list, but explained by symbolic numerology. Evidence severely against. No physical. Evidence for advanced beings. No remains. No artifacts. No technology. No modern analogue for regional climate control, unlike script #23's acoustic levitation, where small-scale examples exist. We have no examples of weather control at regional scale. Universal mythological pattern, all. Cultures have divine flood control, Greek, Norse, Hindu, Chinese, Native American. Why would only Mesopotamia encode real events? Genre confusion, religious texts as technical documentation, ignoring literary and theological functions. Occam's razor violation requires multiple extraordinary assumptions without extraordinary evidence. Missing evidence problems should find devices, non-human remains. Technical descriptions, clear artistic representations distinct from theological imagery. Comparative mythology undermines uniqueness, identical narrative patterns in Greek Deucalion, Hindu Manu, Chinese Gunyu myths. Are all encoding environmental manipulation, or is this universal mythological motif? Strengths. Texts do describe coordinated action and specific sequences. Mathematical precision in some elements is noteworthy. Consistency across independent textual traditions. Weaknesses. Zero physical evidence for advanced beings or technology. No modern proof of concept for. Regional climate control. We can't do it with our advanced technology. Requires extraordinary assumptions without extraordinary evidence. Universal pattern across unconnected cultures undermines Mesopotamia's special claim. Ignores genre and cultural context of religious literature. Extensive. Absence of expected evidence. Archaeological, artistic, technological. Fringe hypothesis rejected by expert scholarly consensus for good evidential reasons. Assessment. Highly speculative with minimal supporting evidence and severe evidentiary gaps, requires assuming extraordinary capabilities and beings for which we have no physical confirmation. This hypothesis is weak and not supported by current evidence. Conclusion. Framework A has strongest evidence across all categories. Framework B is plausible but speculative and unproven. Framework C, actual manipulation, is highly speculative with major evidentiary problems. But important qualification, Framework A doesn't absolutely foreclose other possibilities. Absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. However, extensive absence, where evidence should clearly exist if hypothesis were true, is meaningful. For Framework C, we should find physical traces, clear technical descriptions, artistic depictions distinct from theological imagery. We don't. The question remains technically open for new evidence, but current evidence strongly favours mythological interpretation. Value of investigation. Even though we've concluded the hypothesis is weak, the investigation had value. Rigorous textual analysis. Archaeological evidence examination. Understanding Mesopotamian water management. Exploring knowledge transmission systems. Questioning our own interpretive assumption, intellectual honesty about evidence assessment. The journey has worth even when destination isn't what we hoped. So with 3 frameworks examined and honestly assessed, one final question remains. What does the clay itself tell us? The witness of clay. Let's return to where we began. Leonard Woolley's excavation trench. 8 feet of flood clay. The sterile layer separating one world from the next. In museum vaults today, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the British Museum, the Ashmolean, the Louvre, clay tablets rest in climate-controlled storage. CBS 10673, K3375, BM 78941, the World Blundell Prism. These tablets survived 4,000 years. They passed through the hands of scribes who copied them, priests who preserved them, archaeologists who excavated them, scholars who translated them. Voices speaking across millennia. What we know for certain: real floods occurred. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900-2800 BCA. Cities were destroyed, populations died, civilization was disrupted. Mesopotamians remembered. They wrote detailed accounts preserved across centuries, multiple independent versions, Eridu Genesis, Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, show this wasn't forgotten or dismissed, but carefully transmitted. Accounts were preserved systematically. The precision of copying, the consistency across versions, the institutional effort to maintain these texts, this shows intentional preservation of important memory. Survivors became knowledge keepers. Across all versions, the pattern holds. The worn survivor preserves seed of mankind, makes offerings, receives special status, becomes guardian and teacher. We're still trying to understand. 4,000 years later, we're still reading these tablets, asking what they mean, debating their implications. What remains uncertain, whether Anunnaki were gods, advanced humans, or something else, Kabbalah. Whether environmental manipulation means divine authority, sophisticated knowledge, or actual capability highly Beckletty. Why? Such mathematical precision was preserved, rituary sophistication, data format, symbolic numerology, or encoded meaning. What exactly Emmy of the Flood meant to those who wrote about it? Why antediluvian numbers follow such specific patterns? The value of asking. Perhaps the most important thing isn't definitively proving environmental manipulation occurred. Perhaps it's that asking the question forces rigorous examination of textual patterns, geological evidence, hydraulic capabilities, knowledge transmission systems, and our own interpretive assumptions. The ancient Mesopotamians were sophisticated. Their mathematics, their literature, their architecture, their water management, their institutional organisation all demonstrate remarkable capability. Whether that sophistication came from gods, from their own ingenuity, or from inherited knowledge, they achieved something remarkable. They preserved memory across catastrophe. What the tablets preserve: stories of survival, warnings across time, knowledge of floods and how to prepare, understanding that knowledge itself is worth preserving, connection between past and future, the survivor archetype, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, different names across centuries and languages, but the same essential role: the one who preserved, the one who listened to warning, built protection, saved the sea, the one who emerged from waters and became teacher. Whether the warning came from gods, from wise predecessors, or from their own knowledge and preparation, the archetype remains powerful. Survival requires foresight. Survival requires preparation. Survival requires preserving what matters. And after catastrophe, the survivor becomes teacher. The one who remembers becomes the one who instructs the next generation. Modern relevance. We face environmental challenges today: climate change, rising seas, extreme weather, resource depletion. We have knowledge of coming changes. We have warnings. We have the capability to prepare, to preserve, to protect. We're creating our own tablets for future generations, digital archives, seed vaults, knowledge repositories, climate data, technological documentation. Future people will excavate our record and ask, what did they know? What were they trying to tell us? What did they preserve? Will we be the generation that listened to warnings and prepared, or the generation that ignored them and suffered? The Mesopotamian flood accounts aren't just about the past. They're about the human relationship with catastrophe, knowledge, survival, and memory. The clay tablets rest tonight in their vaults, temperature controlled, humidity managed, protected from light and handling. The flood layers remain in Mesopotamian soil, archaeological markers of ancient catastrophe. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow through Iraq, though their courses have shifted and their waters are managed differently now. And somewhere in the space between mythology and memory, between divine authority and human capability, between what we know and what we wonder, the question waits. Did the Anunnaki manipulate environment? Did they possess capabilities to control water and weather at regional scale? Did they cause floods deliberately and save chosen survivors? The evidence suggests no. The mainstream interpretation, mythology preserving memory of real disasters within theological framework, is almost certainly correct. Or did the Mesopotamians simply do what all traumatized cultures do, remember catastrophe, explain it through divine will, preserve warnings for future generations, and attribute their own survival and knowledge to cosmic favour? The evidence supports this. The texts function as mythology, theology, and literature. They serve social purposes, legitimizing authority, explaining mortality, framing civilization's origins. But even in answering, probably not to environmental manipulation hypothesis, we've learned something valuable. How sophisticated Mesopotamian water management actually was. How carefully knowledge was preserved across millennia, how memory and mythology intertwine, how to assess evidence, honestly even when it doesn't support our hypothesis. Why asking rigorous questions has value regardless of conclusions. If this investigation resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Which framework seems strongest to you? What would change your mind? What evidence would you need to see? The conversation continues in comments, in museums, in universities, in unexcavated tells across Iraq, where tablets still wait in soil. The flood didn't erase everything. Something survived. Someone remembered. And now you know what they preserved. Stories of warning, preparation, survival, and the enduring human drive to save knowledge for those who come after. Sleep well tonight. The ancient floods have long receded. The waters returned to their channels. The cities were rebuilt. But the tablets remain. Patient clay, holding voices, waiting in darkness for the next generation to ask, what did you mean? What were you trying to tell us? What should we preserve? Whether the Anunnaki were gods, humans, or something else, the memory they left behind endures, pressed into clay, baked by time, surviving 4,000 years to reach us now. That survival itself is remarkable. That memory itself is worth honouring. The tablets spoke. We listened. And now we continue the conversation, carrying forward the ancient task, preserving knowledge, warning future generations, ensuring something survives. Good night.